Maeve Callahan had exactly $11 to her name when the black leather briefcase skidded across the wet asphalt and came to rest against the toe of her shoe. It was still a long way from dawn. Passyunk Avenue empty and slick, cold rain slanting through the amber streetlights. She was walking home from her 6th night shift in a row, one hand braced beneath her belly the way only a woman in her 7th month understands, the other pulling up the collar of a coat 2 sizes too big for her. The coat had been Owen's. She had worn it every day for 5 months. Then headlights swept across her back. The black SUV stopped hard at the intersection. The rear door swung open. Something struggled inside. A dark shape flew out, slid the length of the street, and came to rest exactly where she stood. The door slammed, the engine roared, the plates were covered, and the taillights dissolved into the rain as though the car had never been there at all. Maeve did not move. She waited for it to come back. Nothing came back. She bent down, slowly, one hand braced on her knee, and carried the case under the awning of a shuttered laundromat. Inside was money-banded stacks still in their bank wrappers, laid in 2 neat rows like courses of brick. In her head, every number of the last 5 months lined itself up without being asked. The eviction notice taped to her door, the hospital bill hidden under the drawer liner, and 3 weeks until her due date. She thought the thought any mother in her place would have thought, and she thought it longer than she would ever afterward admit. Then she closed the case. Then she opened it again, and this time she saw it a sheet folded in 4, pressed flat against the bottom, its edges worn soft as though it had been opened and folded again many times by many different hands. 9 lines, typed, no heading. The first 8 all carried the same 2 words, paid out. Her eyes traveled down to the 9th. Owen Callahan. Settled. The rain kept drumming on the tin above her, and Maeve read that line 3 times, and then a 4th. Owen Callahan, her husband, the man about whom, 5 months earlier, they had sat at her own kitchen table, folded their hands very neatly, and told her the scaffolding collapse at Pier 6 had been a tragic accident, that he had been careless, that the company was terribly sorry but there were no grounds for compensation. She had signed where she was told to sign. She had thanked him and walked him to the door. "Owen," she said softly, out loud, on the empty sidewalk. No one answered. Maeve folded the paper back along its old creases, and understood that she had left the house that night with $11, and was about to carry home something not one man in this city would allow her to keep. If Maeve's story moves you, leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to walk this road with her all the way to the end. The room she rented sat above a shuttered upholstery shop on Almond Street, 1 room and a hot plate and a window that had been painted shut long before she ever signed for it, and Maeve carried the case up the narrow stairs with both arms wrapped around it, because her hands had stopped being steady somewhere around the 2nd block. She set it on the table. She set the paper down beside it. Then she sat in the 1 chair she owned, and did not move for a long time, and the radiator knocked twice and went quiet, and the cold came up through the floorboards the way it always did, and she looked from the case to the paper and back again the way a person looks at 2 doors when she knows only one of them opens. She had no phone. The company had cut it off 11 days earlier over a bill she could have paid if she had not paid the electric instead, and she had told herself at the time that it was a small thing, that nobody called her anymore anyway, and now she understood that a woman with no phone is a woman with no witness. So she did the only thing she could think of. She pulled the eviction notice off the door, the one with the curled bottom corner, and she turned it over, and she copied all 9 lines onto the blank side in her own hand. She wrote slowly. She wrote the way she had been taught to write in nursing school, the way you write when somebody's life might depend on the difference between a 5 and an 8. And when she came to the 9th line, she wrote it out exactly as it appeared, and then sat back and looked at her own handwriting, spelling out her husband's name, and had to put the pen down. Then she picked it up again and finished. When it was done, she folded her copy into the inside pocket of Owen's coat, buttoned it over, and turned back to the case. That was when she noticed the letter. It was stamped into the leather just below the handle, pressed so deep and so long ago that the grain had gone smooth around it. A single capital B. No name, no company, nothing else. She ran her thumb across it once. In Port Richmond, you did not need the rest of the name. There were men on that side of the river who had worked the docks their entire lives and had never once said the whole thing out loud. And there were bars on Richmond Street where the conversation would drop half a register if somebody said it by accident. And Maeve had grown up 4 blocks from all of it, and had learned the way every girl there learned, which was by watching what the adults did with their faces. She closed the case. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall, and one hand flat on the top of her belly, feeling the small, deliberate shifting underneath. And outside, the rain finally stopped somewhere in the deepest part of the night and left the whole neighborhood dripping and silent. And when the sky over the row house roofs went the color of dishwater, she stood up, put her shoes on, and went to the police. The district station on East Girard had a lobby with a bench bolted to the floor and a bulletproof window with a tray underneath it, and a sergeant behind the glass with reading glasses pushed up into his hair. She slid the paper through the tray. She told him her name, and her husband's name, and the date of the collapse at Pier 6, and she watched him read it. He read it twice. She saw the exact moment he got to the 9th line, because his shoulders came up half an inch and stayed there. He asked her where she got it. She told him. He asked if anyone else had seen it, and she said no, and he looked at her for a second longer than the question needed, and then he told her to have a seat, that he was going to make a call. There was a door behind him with a window in it, wired glass, the kind that lets you see shape and motion, but nothing clean, and Maeve sat on the bolted bench with her hands folded on top of her belly and watched him through it. She could not hear a word. She did not need to. She had spent 5 months serving coffee to men at 3 in the morning, and she had learned to read a person from across a room, the way other people read a headline, and what she saw through that wired glass was not a man making a report. He stood with his back half turned. He had one hand on the back of his neck. He nodded 4 times without saying anything, and he leaned forward slightly at the shoulders, the way a man leans when he is telling somebody that a thing was not his fault. That was not the posture of a sergeant calling in a homicide lead. That was the posture of a man apologizing. When he came back out, he was very kind about it. He said these things take time. He said the accident had been closed out months ago by the state, and there was a process. And the process had a name and a number and an office downtown that was open certain days. And he wrote the address on a slip of paper and pushed it through the tray to her, and he said she should get herself somewhere warm, and he did not look at her when he said it. Maeve reached through the tray and took her paper back. She said thank you. She had thanked the man at her kitchen table too, 5 months ago. And she was beginning to understand that she had spent her whole life thanking people for closing doors gently. She walked out onto East Girard into a gray morning with the trolley wires humming overhead and a dozen men going by in work boots with their lunches under their arms, and she stood there on the corner and let herself understand the shape of what she had just learned. The name on that briefcase was not a name the law was going to help her with. The law had already picked up the telephone and told somebody she had been there, so there was one door left. It was not courage that turned her toward the river. It was arithmetic. Above every man who had lied to her at her kitchen table there was another man, and above him another, and at the top of all of it there was one, and she did not want his money and she did not want his mercy. She wanted to stand close enough to watch his face while he read her husband's name. Barone Maritime Logistics occupied 4 warehouses and a pier at the bottom of Delaware Avenue, and Maeve walked the last half-mile with the case held in both arms against the front of her, the way a woman carries something she has decided not to put down. The main bay doors stood open to the water. Inside, the ceiling went up 3 stories into a lattice of steel and hanging lamps, and the floor was gray, poured concrete that ran out so far in every direction that the men working the far end looked like something happening in another building, and the air smelled of diesel and river water and the cold, sweet rot of wet cardboard. There were maybe 20 of them working the pallets, forklifts turning, a radio going somewhere, a man calling numbers off a clipboard. She got about 30 feet in before the first one saw her. He stopped. The man beside him looked up to see what he was looking at, and stopped. It went across that floor like a light going out in a row of windows, one and then the next, and then all of them, the forklift settling down onto its forks, the clipboard lowering, the radio still going in the corner with nobody listening to it, until there was nothing in that enormous room but the sound of the river slapping the pilings outside, and a pregnant woman in a dead man's coat standing alone on all that concrete, with a black leather case held against her belly. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody came toward her. That was the part she would remember later, that not one of those 20 men asked her what she wanted, because every one of them had already seen what she was carrying. Then a door opened along the office wall, and a man came out and crossed the floor toward her, unhurried, a heavy man in his 40s with gray coming in at the temples and a rain jacket zipped to the chin, and he stopped a few feet short of her and looked at the case, and then at her face, and then at the case again. He asked her to set it down. She said she would rather not. He said it wasn't a request, and he said it politely, and she set it on the concrete between them and stepped back one step and no more. He crouched over it and worked the latch and lifted the lid maybe 4 inches, and Maeve watched the color go out of his face. It was not the money. She was certain of that afterward. He had looked at the money for less than a second. It was what was under it. And he closed the lid before he had finished looking, and stood up much faster than a man his size ought to have been able to, and turned away from her and lifted a radio off his belt and said 4 words into it. She did not catch them. He said them low and flat with his back to her, and then he clipped the radio on again and turned around and told her his name was Salvatore Ricci and that she was going to come with him. He carried the case himself. He walked her along the office wall to a room with a bench and a water cooler, and a calendar from a hardware supply company still turned to a month that had already gone by. And he told her to sit, and he did not lock the door, which she noticed, and he did not have to, which she noticed too. She sat. Her back had been aching since the trolley wires on East Girard, and she pressed the base of her spine against the wall and waited, and after a while she realized she was looking straight through a long interior window into the office next door. It ran the whole length of that wall, glass from waist height to ceiling, blinds pulled up, and whatever was said in there did not come through it. She could see everything and hear nothing. There was a desk. There were 2 chairs on the near side of it. After a few minutes, 2 men brought a third man in, an ordinary-looking man in a canvas work coat, 50 or so, and they sat him in one of the chairs and left, and the man sat there with his hands on his knees, and his knees going up and down, and Maeve watched his mouth move as he said something to the empty room, and nobody answered him, and he stopped. Then the far door opened, and another man came in, and Maeve knew before she had any reason to know. He did not look the way she had expected. He was younger, 30-something, dark hair cut close, a black wool coat he did not take off, no rings, no chain, nothing at all to look at, and he did not raise his voice because he did not say more than a handful of words the entire time she watched him. That was the thing. The man in the canvas coat talked. He talked, and he talked, his hands coming up off his knees and opening toward the desk, and the other one stood there with one hand resting on the back of the empty chair, and let him. He did not interrupt. He did not sit. He did not lean in. He simply waited the way water waits, and the longer he waited, the faster the man in the canvas coat talked, until the talking ran itself out and stopped, and the room went still. Then he took 2 things out of his coat and set them on the desk. Maeve leaned forward. The first was a plain envelope. The second was smaller, a slip of stiff paper, and she could not read it at that distance, but she had seen 1,000 of them in her life, because the Greyhound terminal was 11 blocks from where she grew up, and half the people she knew had left that way. It was a bus ticket. One direction. He said one sentence. She watched it happen. 4 or 5 words, no more, and his face did not change while he said them, and then he walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, and the man in the canvas coat was alone in that room, with an envelope and a ticket in front of him. He did not touch either one. He sat there and looked at them the way you look at an X-ray somebody has just handed you, and Maeve sat on her side of the glass with both hands flat on top of her belly and understood something she had not understood on the walk down Delaware Avenue, which was that, in that building, nobody had to be hurt, because there was nothing left to threaten anyone with, once you had shown them how completely you could arrange their life. She had come here to look at a man's face while he read her husband's name. She had not thought past that. Now she thought past it, and her mouth had gone dry, and she was aware of every one of the 20 men on the other side of that wall, and of the river beyond them, and of exactly how few people in the world knew where she was. Then the door beside her opened, and Salvatore Ricci stood in it, and said Mr. Barone would see her now. The office was warmer than the bench room, and smelled faintly of coffee that had been sitting too long, and the case was already open on the desk when she came in, and Elias Barone was counting. He did it the way a man counts who has counted a great deal in his life, without moving his lips, and without touching more than the edge of each band, and he did not look up when Ricci brought her in, and he did not look up when she stopped in front of the desk. She stood. Nobody offered her the chair the man in the canvas coat had been sitting in, and she did not ask for it, and her lower back was a long, dull ache by then, and she let it be. When he finished, he squared the stacks with 2 fingers and laid them back in their rows. Nothing missing. Not a bill, not a band. And she watched him register that, and she watched it register as a small, unwelcome thing, rather than a good one, the way a man looks at a lock he expected to find broken. Then he lifted the sheet out from underneath and read it. Maeve had spent the walk down Delaware Avenue thinking she would learn something from his face. She learned less than she wanted, and more than he intended. He read it twice, the same as the sergeant had. And when he came to the 9th line, he did not go still the way the sergeant had gone still. He went somewhere else entirely, and his eyes came back up to the top and started again as though the page might read differently the second time. Then he folded it along its own creases and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He said, and it was the first thing he had said to her, that she should go home, and that this had nothing to do with her. He was already deciding. She could see it, the way she could see when a man at her counter had decided to leave without paying, that small settling in the shoulders, and she understood that whatever he decided in the next few seconds was going to be the whole rest of her life. And so she spoke first. She said she had copied it. She said it plainly, the way you tell a doctor a symptom. 9 lines, all of them, in her own hand, last night, before she came anywhere near his building. And no, it was not on her. And no, it was not in that room. And no, she was not going to tell him where it was. She said her telephone had been shut off 11 days ago, and that was the only reason she had written it out at all, and that she supposed she ought to thank the phone company. Then she stopped talking, and Elias Barone looked up at her, and looked at her properly for the first time. And it was not the look a man gives a woman who has just done something brave. It was the look a man gives a door he thought was a wall. He asked how long she had stood in the police station on East Girard. She told him she had not said anything about a police station. He said no, she had not. The room was very quiet after that. She had not been afraid on the walk down, and she had been afraid on the bench, and now she was past it, out the other side into something flat and clear, and she put both hands on the front edge of his desk, because her back would not hold her much longer without it, and she asked him the question she had come to ask. Why was her husband's name in his briefcase? Owen Callahan, Pier 6, 5 months ago, the scaffolding, the man at her kitchen table with his hands folded. Why was it in there, under the money, in a case with his own initial pressed into the leather? And Elias Barone did not answer her. She waited. She had been ready for a lie. She had rehearsed 6 of them on the walk down, and had an answer for each. And what she had not been ready for was silence, and it went on long enough that she understood it was not a tactic. He looked at the pocket where he had put the page. He looked at the far wall. Whatever was happening on that face was not calculation, and it was not guilt. It was the particular blankness of a man being handed a fact about his own house that he did not have, and Maeve stood there in that warm office with her hands on the edge of his desk, and watched the most powerful man in that part of the city discover he did not know something. He said her name once, her whole name, as though checking it against something. Then he reached across the desk and pressed a button on the telephone, and said to whoever answered that nothing moved off the piers until he said so. Not a container, not a truck, not a man. Ricci said something from the doorway about the Norfolk load, and Elias said nothing moves. By noon, 400 men were standing in the yard, with their hands in their pockets, and no shift, and no pay. And by that night, a dozen of them were sitting at a counter on East Passaiunk, with the day's wages gone, ordering the cheapest thing on the board, and the woman refilling their cups without charging them, for it had been standing in that warehouse when the order was given. Salvatore Ricci did not come in the next morning. He had been the first man through those bay doors every working day for 19 years, before the lights, before the coffee, and on the morning after the piers went quiet, he was not there. And by the afternoon, there was a particular kind of silence in the office, where the two-way traffic of his voice usually was. Ilias called him. It rang out. He called the house in Fishtown, and Ricci's sister-in-law said he had not been by, and she said it in the careful way people said things when they were being asked by that family, and Elias thanked her, and hung up, and stood at the window over the water for a long time. On the second day he sent 2 men to the house. The mail had not been taken in. The truck was gone from the alley. On the third day his uncle came down to the pier with 2 coffees, and a bag of rolls from the place on Girard that had been feeding them since before Elias was born. And Carmine Barone set one of the cups on the desk, and said that a man who disappears the same week a stranger walks in carrying your case is not a coincidence, and that he had been saying for 2 years that Sal had gotten comfortable, and that comfortable men get expensive. He said it gently. Carmine said everything gently. He said, "Let me look into it." and Elias said no. And Carmine set both hands flat on the desk and said, "Elias." And Elias said no again without turning around from the window, and his uncle picked up his own coffee and left the rolls and went back up the stairs. For 3 more days nothing moved off the piers, and the yard filled with idle men every morning, and emptied every noon, and Elias sat with the folded page from the case on the desk in front of him, and made telephone calls that he made himself, and every one of them came back the same. Nobody had written that list. Nobody had seen that list. The Pier 6 file was closed at the state level, and had been closed for 4 months, and the closing had been clean, and the cleanliness of it was the part that had begun to sit badly with him, because in his experience, nothing was ever that clean, unless somebody had paid to have it cleaned. On the 7th morning, the door opened, and Salvatore Ricci walked in, and set a paper cup of coffee on the corner of the desk, the way he had set one there every day for 19 years, and said he was sorry, and that it had been a family thing, his wife's brother down in Wilmington, a hospital thing, and that he had not wanted to say it over a telephone. Elias asked him why he had not answered. Sal said his phone had gone in a parking lot, that he had bought a cheap one, that he had the new number written down somewhere and had not gotten around to giving it out. He said it without hurrying, and without adding anything to it, which was the thing about Sal. He never decorated. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with a hospital in Wilmington, and there was a raw place along his jaw that he did not mention and Elias did not ask about, and he stood with his hands loose at his sides while he said all of it. And when he was finished, Elias looked at him for a moment, and then told him to sit down, that there was work. What Elias did not look at, and what a woman who had spent 5 months studying men from behind a counter would have noticed inside of 4 seconds, was the left cuff of Salvatore Ricci's jacket. It had been torn open along the seam near the wrist, and sewn shut again, badly, in a hurry, by somebody working without a light. The thread was gray, the jacket was black. The Blue Marlin sat on East Passyunk between a check-cashing place and a shoe repair that had been closed since the spring, and it ran all night, because Gus Kowalski had run it all night for 31 years and saw no reason to stop, and in the small hours it held whoever the city had left over. That night it held 4 people. 2 men at the corner table who had come in off the idle yard with the last of their money, 1 older woman at the far end of the counter working slowly through a bowl of soup, and Walt Prescott on the 4th stool, where he had sat every night, for as long as anyone could remember. Maeve was wiping down the machine when the bell over the door went. She did not look up right away. She heard the 2 men at the corner table stop talking, and then she heard a chair, and by the time she turned around, one of them was already counting bills onto the tabletop, not waiting for the check, not calling her over, just laying the money down and putting his coat on. And the other one was standing with his back very straight and his eyes on the floor, and the 2 of them went out past the man who had just come in, without either of them looking at him. The bell went again. It was quiet then. Elias Barone took the stool at the end nearest the door, and set nothing on the counter, and asked for coffee, and Maeve poured it, and her hand was steady, which surprised her later. Gus came out of the kitchen, looked once, and went back in and stayed there. Walt Prescott did not move off the 4th stool and did not turn around. Elias let the cup sit. He said he had come to tell her something and that he would only tell her once. He said the page she had found was a piece of paper with 9 names on it, and no letterhead and no signature, and that it proved nothing, and that in a courtroom it was less than nothing, and that the only thing on earth it was good for was getting the person carrying it noticed. He said she had already been noticed. He said the file on Pier 6 was closed, and that closed files stay closed, unless somebody with a reason wants them opened, and that she should ask herself who had a reason. And then he said, quietly, that she was 7 months along, and living alone above a shop on Almond Street, and that he was not telling her that to frighten her. He was telling her because he had found it out in under an hour, and so could anybody else. Then he told her to forget the page. He said it the way a man reads a weather report. He stood up, and he did not raise his voice once from the first word to the last, and he took a bill out of his coat and laid it on the counter beside the cup he had not touched, and he went out. It was 100. Maeve looked at it. Then she came around the end of the counter with it in her hand, faster than she had moved in weeks, out through the door into the cold with the bell still going behind her, and she caught him at the curb. She held it out. He looked at it and did not take it. She said the coffee was $1.80. She said the price was on the board inside, that it had been $1.80 since before her husband died, and it was still $1.80 tonight, and that he was welcome to pay for what he ordered like everybody else who came through that door, and that she would take his money for the coffee and not for anything else. And she stood there on East Passyunk in a dead man's coat, holding $100 bill out into the space between them until he took it back. He put it in his pocket. He looked at her for a second longer, and whatever he had come there to accomplish had not been accomplished, and both of them knew it. Then he got into the car, and it pulled away down toward the river. And Maeve went back inside and rang up one coffee, $1.80, out of her own apron, and put the cup in the sink. And Walt Prescott on the fourth stool said, without turning around, that she ought to be careful. And she said she had been careful for 5 months, and look where it had gotten her. He came back 4 nights later. Maeve heard the car before she heard the bell, and she did not say anything when he took the same stool. And she poured the coffee and set the cup down, and put the check beside it face up so he could read the figure. And he looked at the figure and took out a 5, and she made his change to the penny, and he did not argue. He drank about half of it. He was not there for her. She understood that much. He was there because a man like that does not accept being sent home by a waitress, and needs to sit in the room again to prove the room does not run him, and she let him sit. What neither of them accounted for was Walt Prescott. The old man had been on the fourth stool since before either of them walked in, working through a cup of tea he had been working through for an hour, and at some point Maeve realized he had turned all the way around and was looking down the length of the counter without pretending not to. He looked for a long time, long enough that Maeve stopped wiping, long enough that Elias set the cup down and looked back. And then Walt Prescott said, "Are you Mary Ann's boy?" Nobody said anything. He said, "The one from the mills. She did the night shift at the old textile house on Frankfurt. Before they knocked it down, she had 2 boys and one of them had a face like yours." He said his own name, and where he had worked, and what years, and then he said that in the winter of the year, the river froze. He had split the sleeve of his work coat open on a bale hook, and had no money to have it seen to and no wife anymore to do it. And Mary Ann had taken it home with her and brought it back the next night. And he said you could not find the place afterward if you looked, that she had matched the thread. He said he had tried to pay her. He said she would not have it. She said it took her 20 minutes and a piece of thread. And he said that coat lasted him another 11 years, and he still had it somewhere in a box. Then he said, "I heard she passed." And Elias Barone, who had not raised his voice once in that room, and had never in Maeve's presence needed longer than a breath to answer anything, did not answer. Maeve was standing 4 feet away with a rag in her hand, and she saw it happen. She saw a hospital corridor that she had never been in, and would never see, because he did not describe it, because he did not say one word. But she saw it anyway, in what his face did, and it was this. A boy of 19 at a counter under a bad light, being handed papers, being asked to sign at the bottom of a page he could not read a single line of, because his hand would not hold still, and a woman down the hall who was going to die in the ward they put people in when the money runs out, 4 hours later, without being moved anywhere better, and the boy signing anyway because there was nothing else to do with a pen. He did not tell them that. He put a hand flat on the counter and looked at the old man for a moment and said, "Yes, that was all." Walt Prescott nodded slowly and turned back around on the fourth stool and said, "She was a decent woman," and went back to his tea. Elias left the rest of his coffee. He did not leave anything on the counter that he had not been charged for, and at the door he stopped with his hand on it and did not turn around, and then he went out. They ate at Carmine's house on a Sunday, because they had always eaten at Carmine's house on a Sunday. In the back dining room with the good cloth and the sideboard, his wife had polished every week for 30 years before she died. And that nobody polished now, and there were 9 of them at the table, and none of the 9 said anything that mattered until the plates were cleared. Then Carmine sent the others into the front room. He poured 2 glasses of the Amaro nobody but the 2 of them drank, and set one in front of his nephew, and sat back down at the head of the table where his own brother had sat before him, and he said, "So, the woman." Elias said nothing. Carmine said that he had let it go a week out of respect, and that a week was a long time. He said she had walked into their building in front of 20 men. He said she had gone to the police on East Girard before she came, which they both knew, and that whatever she had gotten from that sergeant she had gotten for free, and that a woman who goes to the police once will go again, and that the second time she will not go to a district station, she will go downtown, because somebody will have told her where downtown is. He said all of this in the tone he used for weather and taxes. He said, "She is a waitress with no telephone and no husband and no money, and a baby coming. Elias, she is not a person with options, and people with no options are the most dangerous people in the world, because they have nothing left to lose and everything left to say. Elias turned the glass a quarter turn on the cloth and said that nothing was going to happen to her. Carmine asked him to say that again. He said it again. Carmine said, "And the paper." And Elias said the paper was his problem, and he was working on it. And his uncle said, "Working on it." And there was a silence at that table then that had not been there in 20 years. Not once, not through the bad winter, and not through the trial, and not through the funeral, and the two of them sat in it and looked at each other across the good cloth, like men who had met somewhere before and could not place it. Then Carmine picked up his glass and turned it in the light and said, mildly, the way a man says a thing about the neighborhood, that it was funny. He had noticed it at the funeral, and he noticed it again now, that Elias got more like his mother every year. He said Marianne had been the same. God rest her. She would carry a thing on her own back until it broke her, rather than let somebody help her set it down. He drank, he said, and look how that went. Elias put his glass on the table without drinking from it, and stood up and said goodnight to the front room, and went out through the kitchen the way he had gone out through that kitchen, since he was a child. He drove. He did not go toward the river, and he did not go home. He came up East Passyunk with the wipers going and pulled to the curb across from the Blue Marlin, and cut the engine and sat there. The window of the place was fogged from the inside, and the light came through it, soft and yellow and moving, and he could see her at the far end by the pass, carrying a stack of plates in both arms held out away from her body, the way a woman carries them when she can no longer hold them against herself. And she set them down, and put one hand on the small of her back, and stood a moment, and then she picked up the coffee pot, and went down the counter to the fourth stool. He watched the whole of it. Then he sat there another 20 minutes with the rain coming down on the roof of the car, and he did not get out. Elias found the requisition on a Tuesday. In the third box of paper he had pulled himself out of the storage room behind the scale house, because he had stopped asking other people to bring him things. Pier 6, first quarter, structural fittings. A supplier in Chester nobody in the company had used before or since. Unit prices about a third of what the yard had paid the year before for the same part number. He looked at the bottom of the page for a long time. Then he carried it up the stairs and put it on the desk in front of Salvatore Ricci, and said one word, which was his name. Sal looked at his own signature. He did not reach for the page, and he did not sit down, and he did not do any of the things Elias had spent 2 days preparing for. He said, "I wondered how long." Then he said, "Ask me the rest." Elias asked him, and Sal told him, standing. In the flat, unadorned way he told everything, that on a Friday afternoon in February, Carmine had come into the trailer with a stack of paper about that thick, and set it on the desk, and said the auditors wanted the quarter closed by Monday, and that he had signed 40 pages of it in 11 minutes, with a man standing over his shoulder, talking about his sister-in-law's kitchen renovation the entire time, and that he had not read one of them, not one, and that he had been signing paper for that family for 19 years, and had never once been given a reason to. He said he found out in June. He said by then Owen Callahan had been dead since March, and he had gone home and sat in his truck in the alley behind his own house for 4 hours, and worked it through, and there was no way through it, because the moment he opened his mouth, the first thing anybody would do, the very first thing, was pull the file, and the file said Salvatore Ricci had bought those fittings. It did not say Carmine. It did not say anybody else. It said him, he said. I could not tell you, because the second I told you I became the man who did it. And there is nothing I could have said after that which you would have been able to believe. And you know that, and I know it, and he knew it when he handed me the pen. Elias asked him where he had been for 7 days. Sal said Carmine had sent Desmond Rourke to take him for a drive down to the yard at Marcus Hook and talk about his memory, and that the drive had started on Delaware Avenue and gone north instead of south, and that somewhere up around the Passyunk cutoff he had made a decision, because there was a case on the floor of that car with the second copy of the list in it, and he had put it there himself 2 hours before out of the safe, and he had gotten a hand on the door and gotten it open, and put the thing out into the street. He said, I could not carry it out of that car. I could put it out. He said he had counted on a street sweeper, or a delivery man, or anybody at all who did not owe this family $1, somebody with no reason to keep quiet, and that whatever happened to him after that, the paper would already be moving. Then he said, quietly, that he had walked back along Passyunk the next morning to see where it had ended up, and there was nothing there, and he had spent 4 days thinking it had gone down a storm drain. Elias did not speak for a while. Then he asked why Sal had come back at all, and Sal Ricci said, "Because you were going to find that requisition eventually, and I would rather be standing here when you did." She had read the 9 names so many times by then that she could say them in order with her eyes shut, and the 7th one had been sitting on the 4th stool of her own counter every night of the last 5 months. Walter Prescott. She had told herself for a week that there were other Prescotts in this city, and there were, and she had gone on telling herself that until the night the place emptied out, and it was only the 2 of them and the machines and the rain. And she took her copy out of the pocket of Owen's coat, where it hung on the peg by the kitchen door, and she came back and set it on the counter in front of him and put one finger on the 7th line figure. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. He had been coming into that place since before she was born, and she watched something in the shape of his shoulders let go. And he said, "I have been waiting 5 months for you to do that." Then he said the number out loud himself before she could ask him. 8,000. He said it was not 30 like some of them, that he was only a checker by then, 63 years old on light duty with a bad hip, and 8 was what a checker was worth. He said he took it in June, in an envelope, in a parking lot behind a bar on Aramingo, and that he had used 4 of it to bury his brother, and the rest was still in a coffee can in his kitchen, and he had not been able to make himself spend $1 of it. And then, because she still had not spoken, he told her the rest. He said Owen had come to him in February, 3 weeks before, with a fitting in his hand. Said the pin bore was wrong. Said the whole run of them was wrong. Said he had pulled 4 off the Pier 6 rig, and every one of them was a knockoff of a part that cost 3 times as much, and that if they loaded that rig the way the schedule said to load it, it would not be a question of whether, only when. He said Owen went up the chain with it and got nowhere, and then went up the chain again, and then somebody came to Owen with an envelope, and Owen took it. He said, "Your husband took it." He said, "I want you to hear that from me, and not from a piece of paper." He said Owen took it on a Thursday, and by the next Thursday he had carried the whole 30,000 back and put it on the desk, and told them he was going to the Federal Safety Office, and that it was not a threat. He had already done it. He had a date and a case number. He had made the call from a payphone on Richmond Street because he did not trust the yard phones. He said that was what killed him. Not the money. The date, he said. And here, Maeve saw the old man's hands begin to move on the counter. That the ones who did it were not trying to kill him, and that he needed her to understand that because he had spent 5 months understanding it, and it had not helped him sleep once. They were going to loosen one joint on the north face so that the platform would drop about 4 feet under him and put him on his back and break his leg. And a man who falls off his own rig is a man who was careless, and a careless man's testimony is worth nothing to a federal inspector. And that was the whole of the plan. That was all it was ever supposed to be. And they used the same cheap fittings to do it that Owen had been warning them about. And the section did not drop 4 feet. It went. He stopped. The soup pot ticked on the range in the back, and the rain came down on East Passyunk. And Maeve stood on her side of the counter with both hands flat on it, and looked at a man she had been pouring free coffee for since the week of the free funeral. Every night, the 4th stool, because he was old and alone, and had known her husband, and she thought about that, and she thought about the $8,000 sitting in a coffee can 4 blocks from here, and she thought that she was going to say something now, and that whatever it was, she would have to live in the same city as it for the rest of her life. He said, "I am not asking you for anything." He said, "I only ever wanted to be sitting close enough that if you needed something and could not ask, I would see it." Maeve looked at him a long time. Then she picked up the pot and refilled his cup, all the way to the top, the way she had every night, and she said, "You are going to tell that to somebody who can write it down." And Walt Prescott put both hands over his face and wept like a child at the counter of an empty diner. And she stood there and let him, and did not tell him it was all right, because it was not, and did not walk away, because that was not the same thing. She did not sleep that night either. She came up the stairs on Almond Street after her shift, with the words still going in her head, took it back, went to the federal office, had a date, and she sat down on the edge of the bed with her shoes still on and looked at the case, which had been sitting under the table by the painted shut window since the morning she came back from Delaware Avenue, without it being taken from her, because he had let her keep it, because it was hers to carry now, and she had not opened it since. She opened it. The money was there. She did not count it. She lifted the stacks out 2 at a time and set them on the bed beside her, because she wanted to see the bottom of the thing. And when the bottom was clear, she sat looking at it, and it was wrong. It sat too high. She had spent 2 years in nursing school learning to notice the difference between what a thing looked like and what a thing measured. And she put her hand down flat inside and pressed and felt it give, just slightly, along the edge nearest the hinge. It was a board covered in the same lining, cut to fit, held by nothing but friction and age. She worked her fingernails into the seam and lifted it out. There was one envelope underneath. Manila, the ordinary kind, soft at the corners, thick, with the flap folded in rather than sealed. And she saw the writing on the front of it before she understood that she was looking at writing. It was 5 words in blue ballpoint. She knew that hand. She had known it on grocery lists, held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a fish, on the back of a photograph. On a note left on a kitchen table at 4 in the morning telling her not to wait up, on 19 years of birthday cards, and her body understood it a full second before her mind did, and she heard herself make a sound in that empty room that she did not recognize. Then she read it. Give this back to whoever sent it. She opened the flap. It was money, banded the same as the rest, and she did not have to count it because there was a slip of yellow legal paper folded on top of it in the same blue ballpoint, and it said, in her husband's small, square, careful hand, 30,000, returned in full, February 27th, and then a line she read 11 times, which said, I did not use any of it. And then his signature, the way he signed everything, the whole name, as though it mattered. She sat on the floor. She did not remember getting there. And it all turned over at once. The way a word you have been mispronouncing your whole life turns over the first time you hear somebody say it right. Because settled did not mean what she had believed it meant on a wet sidewalk in the middle of the night, with the rain coming down on a tin awning. It was not a word about a man. It was a word about an account. 8 of them had taken it and kept it, and the ledger called that paid out, and 1 of them had taken it and brought it back, and the ledger closed him out and called it settled, and that was all it had ever said. And for 5 weeks, she had been carrying a piece of paper that she thought was a confession, and it was nothing but bookkeeping. He had taken it. In February, with her 4 months along and the boiler out and both of them counting, he had taken it, and he had carried it home in this case, or one like it, and put it somewhere in that little house, and said nothing to her for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, he had brought it back and signed his own name to it, and made his phone call from a payphone on Richmond Street. She sat on the floor of a rented room with a dead man's handwriting in her hands, and thought about a woman standing under a laundromat awning, with 2 rows of banded money open on her knees, and 3 weeks to go, thinking the thought, thinking it longer than she would ever afterward admit. Then she folded the yellow paper back the way he had folded it, and put it in the envelope, and put her hand over her mouth, and stayed on the floor a long while. The box had come from the yard 11 days after the funeral, brought to the old house on a Saturday by a young man in a company jacket who had said he was sorry for her loss, and had not been able to look at her while he said it, and she had put it in the hall closet and closed the door, and when she lost the house, she had carried it to Almond Street and put it under the bed, and never once put her hand on the lid. It was a copier paper box with his name written on the end in marker. Not his writing, somebody else's. She pulled it out. The tape had let go by itself on one side. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame because getting down there was easier than getting up would be, and she took the lid off, and the first thing that came up out of it was the smell, which was the smell of the inside of a work truck, cold coffee and cardboard, and the particular dust that comes off concrete. And it was so exactly and completely him that she had to sit still for a moment with her eyes closed. The hard hat was on top, scuffed white, his last name on a strip of tape across the back. His gloves, the right one worn through at the thumb the way it always was. A tape measure, a folded newspaper from a Tuesday in March, a travel mug she had given him, a paperback with the cover off. And underneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, flat against the cardboard, a small white shoebox she had never seen before. She lifted it out and it weighed nothing at all. Inside, in tissue paper, were 2 shoes the length of her thumb. White, soft-soled, laces the width of a shoestring from a card of them, the smallest size they make, and the price tag was still stapled to the tissue with the store name printed across the top, a shop on Girard she had walked past 1,000 times, and the date was printed under the total. It was 4 days before. He had bought them on a Tuesday and gone up on that rig on a Saturday, and the amount at the bottom of the tag was $9 and change, and she knew, without having to work it out, where $9 had come from in that house in that month, because she had done the books at that kitchen table herself, and there had been nothing, and it had come out of a pay envelope he had not cashed yet, and it had not come out of $30,000 sitting somewhere in that same house for 3 days. He had never told her. He had bought them and hidden them in his truck or his locker and said nothing, waiting for something. A Sunday, a good week, the day the boiler got fixed, some right moment that he was still saving up for on the Saturday morning, he put his hat on and went out the door. Maeve Callahan sat on the floor of a rented room above a shuttered upholstery shop with a pair of shoes in her 2 hands. And outside the painted shut window the city went on doing whatever it was doing, and she bent forward over them as far as she was able to bend anymore, and she stayed there a long time. He sent word through Gus, which she understood was deliberate. A message left with a man she trusted instead of a car pulling up outside her door, and it said only that if she wanted to see where it happened, he would meet her there, and she should come in daylight. She went. She brought the case. Pier 6 had been out of service since March, and the fence around it had a chain on it that he unlocked himself, and inside there was nothing but a long apron of cracked asphalt going out to the water, and the rig still standing at the far end under a tarp gone gray. And the wind coming off the Delaware in November went through Owen's coat like it was not there. 2 container ships were working downriver. The gulls were loud. He was standing about halfway out with his hands in his pockets, and he did not come to meet her. He waited for her to walk the whole length of it, and she understood that too, and she took her time because her back would not let her do otherwise. When she reached him, he took a folded page out of his coat and held it out. She did not take it right away. He said, "Before you decide anything, read that." It was a directive on company letterhead, dated the first week of January, addressed to yard supervisors and purchasing, and it was 4 sentences long. It said that materials and consumables costs across all 7 berths were to come down 20% for the quarter, that supervisors were to source accordingly, that exceptions required written approval, and it was signed at the bottom in a hand she had by then seen on nothing else, and the name under the signature was his. She read it twice. He said, "That is mine." He said he had signed it in an office with a view of the water because the numbers for the previous year had been soft, and there was a bank in New York he needed to show a better margin to, and that he had never in his life stood on Pier 6 before that spring and did not know the name of a single fitting used on that rig, and that he had put 4 sentences on a piece of paper in January and had not thought about it again until the middle of March. And then he said the rest of it, standing on the cracked asphalt in the wind with his coat collar down and his hands out of his pockets now, because there was no way to say it and hold anything back at the same time. That a man in his family had read those 4 sentences the way they were always going to be read, which is that the cheapest thing available is the thing you buy, and had found a supplier in Chester, and put another man's name on the order. That when her husband came up the chain in February with a fitting in his hand, the man he was complaining to was the same man who had bought it. That when the envelope did not work, they went back to the cheap fittings a second time and used them to arrange a fall, and that the plan was a broken leg and a ruined reputation, and a federal inspector shown a drunk on a rig, and that the plan did not survive contact with the parts. He said, "Nobody laid a hand on your husband." He said, "2 men killed him with paperwork, and I signed the first page of it." The gulls went over. She stood there with the directive in one hand and the case in the other, and looked past him at the rig under its tarp, at the gray water and the cranes on the Jersey side, and she thought about how he had brought her here to give her the one document in the world that could be traced to him on the day when he could simply have said nothing, when he could have let her go on believing what everybody who had ever spoken to her about Pier 6 wanted her to believe. And she understood that he was not asking her to absolve him, and had not brought her here to be forgiven. That was somehow worse. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you are going to find it eventually." He said, "And I would rather be standing here when you do." And Maeve heard something in the shape of that sentence, though she did not know where she had heard it, and it did not soften one thing. She held out the folded page, and he did not take it, and she let go of it anyway, and the wind took it a few feet along the asphalt and pinned it against the base of the rig. Then she set the case down on the ground between them and pushed it toward him with her foot, and she said, "My husband is dead, because he would not keep money that belonged to people like you." She said, "I want you to hear the rest of it, because I have carried it around for 5 weeks, and I am done carrying it by myself." She said, "I stood under an awning in the rain, and I looked at your money, and I thought about it. I thought about my rent, and I thought about the hospital, and I thought about how nobody on this earth would ever have known. And I sat there and I thought about it for a long time. And the only reason I am not a woman who took it is that I looked in the bottom of the case first. She said, he had 4 days to be a man who took it, and he handed it back. She said, I had one night. Then she said, do not come to the diner again. And she turned around and walked back up the length of Pier 6 with the wind behind her, one hand under the shelf of her belly, past the rig and the gray tarp and the cracked asphalt and out through the gate in the fence, and she did not look back at him once. And he stood where she had left him, with a briefcase full of money at his feet, and let her go. The federal building on Market Street had a metal detector and a woman at a desk who asked her 3 times who she had an appointment with, and Maeve gave the name each time, and eventually a young man came down and took her up to the 5th floor, to an office with a window that looked out at the side of another building. Bernadette Shaw was somewhere near 50, gray coming in and not being fought about it, sleeves pushed up, and she shook Maeve's hand and looked at the shelf of her belly and asked if she wanted the chair with arms on it, and Maeve said yes, and that small, ordinary courtesy nearly undid her after the walk up Market Street. She put it all on the desk. The copy in her own handwriting on the back of an eviction notice, the manila envelope with 5 words on the front in blue ballpoint, and the yellow legal slip inside. The directive on company letterhead, dated the 1st week of January, 4 sentences, signed at the bottom. She said Walter Prescott would tell them about the fittings and the offer and the federal appointment, and would say it under oath, that she had his word on it. She said she wanted her husband's file reopened, and she wanted the word careless taken off it, and she had rehearsed that sentence on the trolley, and it came out steadier than she expected. Shaw listened without writing anything down, which Maeve found strange until she understood it. And when it was finished, she squared the pages with 2 fingers and said, Mrs. Callahan, none of this is new to me. Then she turned in her chair and lifted a folder off the credenza behind her and laid it on the desk between them. It was 3 inches thick, and the rubber bands on it had gone brittle. She turned the cover so that Maeve could read the tab. It did not say Carmine Barone. Shaw let her look at it for a while. Then she said that this office had been working that name for 11 years, across 3 United States attorneys, and had never once put a charge on it that stood up, and that everything in that folder was true, and none of it was provable, and that she had learned to live with the difference. She said the entire question of Pier 6 came down to one document, which was the birth time and materials log for that quarter, the physical book, because the book showed which fittings went on that rig, on what date, signed off by which supervisor, against which purchase order. She said with the book, the requisition, and Prescott on the stand, she could take the whole structure down. And she said, so you understand what you are holding, that the book does not only reach the man who bought those parts, it reaches the man whose signature is on the January directive, and it reaches him under a statute that does not care whether he ever set foot on that pier. Maeve did not say anything. Shaw said, I am telling you now, rather than later. She said the office had subpoenaed that log twice in the spring, and been told both times that it was lost in a records move, and that it was not lost, and that nobody with a badge was ever going to walk into a Barone warehouse and find it. Then she took a card out of her drawer, and wrote a direct line on the back of it, and slid it across the desk and said, I am not going to ask you to do anything. She said, I want to be very clear about that, Mrs. Callahan. And Maeve sat in the chair with arms on it in an office on the 5th floor, with her hands folded on top of her belly, and understood exactly what she was being asked. Gus Kowalski had a cousin named Teddy Nowak, who had held the janitorial contract for the Port Administration offices for 22 years, and Maeve did not ask Gus for anything. She asked him a question, which was whether anybody in his family still cleaned down there, and Gus looked at her for a while over the pass, and then wiped his hands on his apron and gave her a telephone number and said, Do not tell me what this is. Teddy Nowak had a woman named Renata on the weeknight crew who wanted a Thursday off for her daughter's recital and could not get it, and it cost Maeve $40 out of the tip jar and a promise to keep her mouth shut, and that was the whole of the arrangement. 1 night, 1 badge, 1 cart. In and out with the crew when the crew went. She got the badge with somebody else's photograph on it and a lanyard, and she wore the gray smock over Owen's coat because the building was cold. And she went in with 4 other women through the service door on the riverside when the shift started, and nobody looked at her twice, because nobody has ever once looked twice at a woman pushing a cleaning cart. The administration building was 3 floors. The crew took the first 2 together, and then split. and Maeve took the third alone, because it was the smallest, and she said her back was bad, and the woman running the crew looked at her belly and told her to take her time and not lift anything. She had until they finished. That was the clock. She started at the far end and worked the offices in order with the cart in the doorway of each one, so that anyone coming down the hall would see a cart before they saw her, and she emptied the baskets and wiped the desks and did the work properly, because a person doing the work properly is invisible, and a person standing still is not. And while she did it, she read every label on every drawer and every spine on every shelf. Birth records were kept by year and then by birth. She found the year. Births 1 through 5 were in the second office, and births 7 through 9 were in the third, and there was nothing between them, no gap in the run, no empty slot, as though the number 6 had never existed on that river. And she stood in that little office with a spray bottle in her hand, and felt her heart going, and made herself finish the baseboards before she moved. She thought it through. A book that is not lost and not filed is a book somebody put somewhere on purpose, and a man who puts a thing somewhere on purpose puts it where he can get at it, and there were only 2 rooms on that floor she had not been able to open. When the truck came for the dumpsters, she heard it below the window, and she knew the crew would be halfway through too. The supply room off the stairwell was unlocked, because supply rooms always are. It held paper and toner and a broken chair and 11 cases of copier paper stacked against the back wall. And the stack was 1 box deep everywhere except the left corner, where it was 2, and the front box in the left corner had no lid tape on it and had been opened and closed enough times that the flaps had gone soft. She lifted it down and set it on the floor. It was full of paper. She put her hand down the side of it anyway, between the ream and the cardboard, the way she had put her hand into the bottom of a briefcase in a rented room, and her fingers found the hard edge of a bound cover. She got it out. It was a ledger, green cloth over board, the yard's name stamped on the front, and she opened it in the middle, and there were dates and births and part numbers and a column of initials down the right side, and she turned back to the first quarter and found the page and read 4 lines of it and put her hand flat on the page. Then the lights went off in the hallway below her. That was the second floor finishing. She had the length of a stairwell. She put the ledger inside the smock against her ribs and buttoned the coat over it and put the box back on the stack with the soft flaps facing out the way she had found them, and she pushed the cart out into the hall and down to the elevator and rode it with 3 other women who talked about the recital the whole way. And she went out through the service door on the riverside with the crew when the crew went. What she had no way of knowing, and did not learn until much later, was that a supply room on the 3rd floor of the administration building had a camera in the corner of the ceiling that had been put there to stop people taking toner. They came the next night. She had put the ledger where nobody would think to look for it, and had gone in for her shift, because not going in would have said more than going in, and the place was empty the way it always was at that hour. Gus in the back with the fryer down. Walt not yet arrived, the radio going low. Then 2 sets of headlights came up East Passyunk, and did not go past, and swung in, and sat there at the curb, with the engines running, and the beams coming through the front window, and laying 2 long white rectangles across the floor, and up the wall behind the counter, and Maeve stood very still with a cup in her hand, and watched her own shadow appear on the wall in front of her. Desmond Rourke came in first. He did not say anything for a moment. He walked the length of the room slowly, looking at the stools, the way a man looks at a room he is deciding about, and then he said her name, and said they were going to have a conversation about a book. Gus Kowalski came out of the kitchen wiping his hands, and put himself in the gap at the end of the counter between Rourke and where she was standing, and said this was his place, and it was closed. And Rourke looked at him almost kindly and said, "Gus, sit down." Gus did not sit down. What happened after that happened fast, and was mostly noise. The stainless pot went off the burner and hit the floor. The pie case came over, and the glass in it let go all at once, with a sound like a wave breaking. And one of them went down the counter, with his arm out, and took the whole line of it. The sugar, the napkin holders, the ketchup, the tray of cups, 30 years of Gus Kowalski's mornings going across the tile in one long crash, and somebody put a stool through the front window, and the cold came in. Maeve went back against the shelving with both arms crossed over the front of her. She did not scream. She would think about that afterward, that she had not made a sound the whole time, that some old animal part of her had understood that the thing to do was be small and be quiet and be behind something. She heard Gus say her name once. Then there were more headlights, 3 cars, and the sound of doors. and it stopped the way weather stops. And men she had seen on a concrete floor on Delaware Avenue came in through the broken front of the diner and took Desmond Rourke out of it, and it was over inside a minute. Salvatore Ricci was the last one through the door, and he came around the end of the counter and found her sitting on the floor with her back against the low shelf and the pie case glass all around her, both hands flat on top of her belly, breathing carefully the way you breathe when you are counting. And he crouched down and did not touch her and said, "Mrs. Callahan, look at me. Are you hurt anywhere?" And she said no. She said it twice. He asked her again and she said no. "I am not hurt. Gus is bleeding. Go help Gus." And Sal said somebody was already helping Gus. She sat there a while longer because getting up was going to take help, and she was not ready to be helped yet. And she looked at the room, at the stools bolted to the floor, and the wet tile and the sugar everywhere, and the wind coming through the front of the place, and out past it, across the street, a car that had pulled up sometime during all of it, and had not come any closer. The next afternoon, in an office above the water, Elias Barone found out how Desmond Rourke had known which shift she worked and which room she rented. It was a dispatcher in the yard office named Kevin Hollis, who had been in the administration building the morning after the ledger went missing, and had put two things together and sold both of them for $600. Elias did not have him brought in. He made 4 telephone calls. The first was to a bank on Frankfurt where Hollis had a mortgage that had been restructured twice as a favor, and it was unrestructured. The second was to the company that leased Hollis the truck he was making payments on. The third was to a man who owned the building where Hollis's mother had lived, rent-controlled for 19 years, and Elias did not ask for her to be put out. He asked only that the arrangement that had kept the rent where it was be allowed to expire, which it did. The fourth was to the Union Hall, and after that call there was not a berth on that river, nor in Camden, nor in Wilmington, where Kevin Hollis's name would clear. By the end of the week, the man had left the city with what fit in a car that was no longer his. Sal Ricci stood in the doorway while the last of it was arranged and said, quietly, that it seemed heavy for $600. Elias Barone put the phone down and said, "He sold a pregnant woman's address." He said, "He is going to wake up tomorrow." Then he went back to his paper. It came on a Sunday morning, 4 days later, in the quietest week she had had in months. She had slept most of Saturday. The diner was closed while Gus got the front of it boarded and the glass replaced, and for the first time since the funeral, Maeve had nowhere she was supposed to be, and she had gone to bed early and woken up in the dark before dawn, with her back aching in a way that was not the way it had been aching. And she lay there for a while, telling herself it was the bed. By the time the light came up, she knew. She got herself down the narrow stairs of the building on Almond Street, holding the rail with both hands, and got the door open, and she stood on the step in the cold, looking down an empty Sunday street, with no telephone in the room behind her, and no car at the curb, and 11 blocks between her and any hospital worth the name, and she was still standing there working out what to do when the car that had been parked across from the Blue Marlin every night that week came around the corner. He did not ask her any questions. He got out and came up the step and put a hand under her arm, and she let him. And he put her in the front seat and reclined it back and drove. He did not talk on the way, and neither did she, except once, when he asked her which hospital and she said whichever one is closest, and he said no, and took her to the good one, up on the hill, the one with a name on it that people in her neighborhood said the way you say the name of a city you have never been to. He walked her in through the doors himself, and then Maeve, in the middle of everything her body was doing, saw something happen to the man beside her in that corridor. She would remember it later because it was so small. He stopped between the doors and the desk, half a step, the length of a breath, and looked down the hallway that went off to the left, at nothing, at a corridor with a floor buffer against the wall and a row of doors, and something went across his face that had nothing to do with her, and then it was gone and he was moving again. He gave them her name. When they asked about insurance, he took out a card and put it on the counter and said, "All of it." And when the woman started to explain the difference between what was covered and what was not, he said, "All of it," again, in the same voice, and signed where they turned the form around, and did not read it, and did not need to, and put his own name on the line at the bottom of a hospital page in a hallway he had walked out of once before, without doing any of that. Then they took her back. A doctor came out to him sometime later, a woman with reading glasses on a chain, and told him the baby was coming early, and that they were doing everything to slow it down, and would keep doing that as long as they safely could. She said the mother was worn thin, that she had been working nights on her feet for months on end, and had been carrying more than a body carries well. And then she said, "And I want you to hear this, because everybody's family asks me, and nobody believes me. This is not anyone's fault. Nobody did this. Sometimes it comes early." And Elias Barone said thank you, and asked where he could wait. And the doctor pointed, and he went and sat down in a molded plastic chair in a hallway in that hospital. And he stayed there. The girl was born a little before noon on Monday, 5 weeks and 2 days early, and she weighed 4 pounds and 11 ounces, and Maeve named her Rosalie after her own mother without having to think about it for 1 second. They told her the baby was small and strong, and would be staying with them a while, some weeks, until she had learned to eat and had put the weight on. And Maeve said all right, and asked when she could hold her, and they told her soon, and it was soon. She came in a wheeled chair with a blanket over her knees, because she could not walk the corridor yet. And they put the baby in her arms, and left the two of them alone for a long time, and Rosalie Callahan opened one hand against her mother's chest, and got hold of her mother's little finger, and did not let go of it. And Maeve sat in that quiet room and looked at 4 pounds and 11 ounces of her husband's stubbornness with somebody else's nose, and said, in a voice she did not use in front of anybody, Well, look at you." Elias Barone did not go in. He stood at the window of the room down the hall where they kept the small ones, with his hands at his sides, and watched a nurse do the ordinary things nurses do. And at some point the nurse took a narrow band of white plastic off a tray and closed it around the baby's ankle, and turned it so that the printing faced up. And it was so new that it was still bright, and it caught the light. Elias put his hand inside his coat. He took out a piece of white plastic that had gone the color of weak tea, the printing on it faded but readable, cut open on one side with a pair of scissors by a 19-year-old in a corridor 11 blocks, and 15 years from where he was standing. And he held it in his palm, and looked from it to the ankle behind the glass, and they were the same object, identical, the same width, the same clasp, the same cheap white plastic. One of them come apart with age, and one of them so new it had a smell, and a man who had not cried at his mother's funeral or at his father's stood at a window in a hospital corridor, and had to put one hand flat on the frame to keep himself upright. He stayed there until he had it back. Then he put the old one in his pocket, and went and sat down again in the plastic chair. Late that afternoon, Maeve was wheeled back to her own room and asked for a telephone, and they told her there was a payphone by the elevators on that floor, and she said she would rather use that one, and a nurse walked her down and left her there. She had the card in the pocket of her cardigan, the one with the direct line written on the back in Bernadette Shaw's own hand, and she stood in the alcove by the elevators in a hospital gown and a borrowed cardigan, and put in the coins and dialed it. Shaw picked up on the second ring. Maeve told her she had the birth log for the first quarter, the physical book, that it was not in her room on Almond Street, and not in the diner, and that she would say where it was to Shaw, and to nobody else. She said Walter Prescott would testify. She said her own name, spelled out, and her husband's, and the words she wanted taken off his file. And then she stood there with the receiver against her ear while Shaw wrote it all down, and she looked down the corridor toward the room, where a man in a black wool coat was sitting in a molded plastic chair with his forearms on his knees, waiting to be told she was all right. And she knew exactly what was on page 1 of that book, and exactly whose signature the January directive carried, and she did not stop, and she did not soften it. And when Shaw asked her whether she understood what the book reached, she said yes, and gave her the address of the storage place on Aramingo and the number of the locker. Then she hung up. She stood in the alcove a while longer with her hand still on the receiver. Then she went back down the hall, and he stood up when he saw her coming. And she said the baby was small, and she was going to be fine. And he said good. And neither of them said anything else, and she did not tell him. The word came through 2 nights later, through a man on the Camden side, who had never given them a bad piece of information in 9 years, that Carmine Barone would be at berth 9 before first light to put a container on a ship that was not going to Norfolk, and that everything he had left in this world would be inside it. Elias took it the way you take a thing you have been waiting for. He put 6 men in 2 cars and told Sal to bring 4 more up the service road from the north end, and to sit on the gate, so that nothing came off that pier without going past him, and they went down to the water while the city was still dark. The fog had come up off the Delaware the way it does in late November, thick and low and moving, so that the stack lights on the cranes floated with nothing under them, and the container rows went away into gray after 40 feet, and the whole of berth 9 was a wall of steel boxes, with the water somewhere behind it, making the sound water makes against pilings. Elias walked out along the row himself, with his hands out of his pockets. He was not afraid of his uncle. That was the strange part, that he had come down there in the fog to end 19 years of Sunday dinners, and what he mostly felt was tired. He found the container. It was open. It was empty. Swept out. Not one thing in it. And the seal that should have been on it was lying in the gravel below the doors and had been cut. And Elias stood in front of that open box, with the fog going past him, and felt the shape of it arrive all at once, the way you feel a step that is not there. Nobody was coming. Nobody had ever been coming. He turned around and looked back up the length of berth 9, at his own men standing in the fog with their collars up, 6 of them here, and 4 more sitting on a gate at the north end, 10 men and 2 cars and himself, all of it out at the bottom of Delaware Avenue in the dark, 3 miles from anything, exactly where a piece of information had put them. And he understood that he had not been outmaneuvered on that pier at all. He had simply been asked to leave the rest of the city, and he had gone. He said one word out loud. Then he was moving. Because there was only one thing in Philadelphia that night that his uncle needed hours for. And it was not a container, and it was not him. The book itself was gone. It was in a federal locker with a receipt on it, and Carmine would know that by now. And there was nothing left to destroy but the part that could stand up in a room and say it out loud. There was a 63-year-old man who had taken $8,000 in a parking lot behind a bar on Aramingo and had spent 5 months sitting on the 4th stool of an all-night diner on East Passyunk. And there was a copy of 4 pages of that ledger that Maeve had made on the machine in the back office before she ever put the book in the locker, and Walt Prescott had them folded in his coat because she had asked him to keep them somewhere that was not her room. Elias was already running for the car. He got the door open and had the phone in his hand, and he was calling the diner, and it rang, and it rang, and it rang. Maeve Callahan was not there. She was 11 blocks and a river of streetlights away, asleep in a hospital bed on the 4th floor with her daughter, 3 doors down under a warm light, and a nurse checking on both of them every hour. And she did not hear a telephone ring, and did not know anything at all until the middle of the next morning. That is the first thing to say about that night. Salvatore Ricci was sitting on the north gate at berth 9 when the call came from Elias, and he was closer, and he went. He came up Delaware Avenue and cut across at Washington with the fog thinning out behind him, and he did not use the radio because there was nothing to say into it that would arrive faster than he would. Gus Kowalski had the place open, because Gus always had the place open. There were 4 people inside. Gus and Walt Prescott on the 4th stool with 4 photocopied pages folded in the inside pocket of a coat that a woman had mended for him 30 years ago, and a night dispatcher eating eggs at the far end, and a young woman named Deb, who had been picking up Maeve's shifts since Monday. What happened after that was over very quickly, and almost none of it was seen by anybody who could later say so with certainty. The fire company report would say the front and rear of the building went at nearly the same moment, and that whoever did it had come and gone before the first engine turned onto East Passyunk, and that no vehicle was ever identified. What the neighbors saw, the ones who came out onto their steps in their coats with their arms folded, was the plate glass window of the Blue Marlin lit up orange from the inside, like a lamp somebody had turned on in an empty room, and then the shape of a man's back against it, and then people coming out. The dispatcher came out. Deb came out, and a woman across the street took her by the shoulders and sat her down on a step. Gus Kowalski came out through the kitchen door into the alley, with the sleeve of his shirt burned, and stood in the alley shouting a name into the doorway until 2 men pulled him back off it. And Salvatore Ricci came out the front, carrying Walt Prescott, 63 years old and 190 pounds, out across the sidewalk and down off the curb into the street where the air was, and he set him down and put a hand on his chest, and asked him whether he had them, and the old man got the 4 folded pages out of his coat, and put them in Sal Ricci's hand, and then Sal stood up and looked at the front of that diner, and somebody who was standing near enough said afterward that he asked Gus one question, which was whether that was everybody, and Gus, who had been shouting a name into a doorway for a minute and a half, said Deb's cousin was in the back, so he went in again. The engines came up East Passyunk about 90 seconds later. They found Deb's cousin in the alley behind the building, unhurt, having gone out the rear door before any of it, and by the time anybody was able to tell Gus Kowalski that, the front of the Blue Marlin had come down across the counter, and the stools and the tile that Gus had mopped every night for 31 years, and the men in the turnout coats would not let anybody near it. Elias Barone arrived while they were still fighting it. He came up the sidewalk past the parked engines and stopped in the middle of the street, and stood there with the light of it on his face. And a fire lieutenant told him to move back, and he moved back. He did not say anything to anybody for a long time. Around dawn, a man he had known for 19 years, who had brought a paper cup of coffee to the corner of his desk every working morning of all of them, was brought out of that building, and Elias Barone was standing on East Passyunk when it happened, and he did not look away. And Gus Kowalski sat on the curb beside a hydrant with a blanket over his shoulders and wept. And the 4 photocopied pages were in an evidence bag in the back of a car belonging to the federal government by 8 o'clock that same morning, they told Maeve at 11. A nurse came and got her because there were 2 police officers at the desk, and she came down the corridor holding the rail with one hand, and she had just come from feeding her daughter, and her cardigan still smelled like the room they kept the small ones in, and she stood there and listened to a young officer tell her that the Blue Marlin had burned, that Gus Kowalski was at Jefferson with his arm and would be all right, that Walter Prescott had been taken out and was going to be all right, and that a man named Salvatore Ricci had not come out. And Maeve Callahan, who had been asleep in a clean bed on the 4th floor with the safest thing in her life, 3 doors down, put her back against the corridor wall and slid down it, and the terrible part was not that she had almost died. It was that she had not been anywhere near it. He did it in a day and a half, and he did all of it sitting down. There was a restaurant on 11th Street below Washington that the family had eaten in since before Elias was born. 3 tables in the front and a back room with a door, and he took the back room on a Wednesday morning with a telephone and a folder and a pot of coffee, and he did not leave it until it was finished. He started with the paper. Every hauling contract, every berth lease, every equipment note, every warehouse on that river that ran through the 2 companies his uncle had been given to run, and by that evening not one of them had Carmine Barone's name anywhere on it, because every one of them had contained the same clause for 20 years, and nobody had ever read it but the man who signed them. He called the bank on Chestnut. He called the second bank, in Wilmington, that his uncle believed nobody knew about, and it turned out that the man whose signature had opened it in 1991 was still, on paper, the second name on it. He called the Union Hall, and did not ask for anything. He simply told them where the contracts had moved to, which was the same thing. Then he called the suppliers, one at a time, 11 of them, and to each one he said a version of the same 3 sentences, that as of Friday Carmine Barone did not speak for anything on that river, that any invoice bearing his authorization from that date forward would not be honored, and that he was telling them himself as a courtesy, so that nobody would be embarrassed later. He was polite to all 11. 2 of them tried to ask a question, and he let the silence answer it. And then the men, he did not send anybody away, and he did not threaten one of them. He put out word that the Pier 5 office would be open Thursday and Friday, and that anyone who had been working for his uncle could come in and be told where they now stood. And by Friday afternoon, 19 of the 22 had come in, and the other 3 had left the city on their own, and Desmond Rourke had been in federal custody since the morning after the fire. His uncle came to 11th Street on Saturday. He came alone because there was no longer anybody to bring, and he came in through the front, past the 3 empty tables, and stood in the doorway of the back room in his good coat, 70 years old, and looked at his nephew sitting at the table where the family had always sat. Elias did not stand up. Carmine said his name. Then he said that he had held that river together for 30 years, and that half of what the boy was sitting on had been built by him. And Elias let him say all of it, the whole speech, the way he had let a man in a canvas coat talk himself out in a warehouse office months before. And when it was finished, Elias took an envelope out of his coat and put it on the table and pushed it across. His uncle looked at it and did not touch it. Elias said, "Open it." It was a hospital bill. It was 15 years old. It was a photocopy, and it was made out for the amount owed on the account of Marianne Barone at a charity ward on the north side of the city, unpaid, and stamped at the bottom with the date it had been sent to collection. And Elias had carried that piece of paper folded in a drawer since he was 19 years old, and had never once shown it to anybody. He said, "You were at the table when I came home with this," he said. "You told me the family did not have it." Then he stood up and put his chair in, and said there was a car outside that would take his uncle wherever he wanted to go tonight, and after tonight there would not be a car. And he walked out through the 3 empty tables onto 11th Street, and got into his own car, and sat there for a moment. Then he took out his telephone and called the direct line of Bernadette Shaw at the United States Attorney's Office, and said he would like to come in on Monday, and that he would be bringing everything. He came in on the Monday with 2 lawyers and 11 boxes, And by the end of that week, Bernadette Shaw had on her floor the complete internal records of every company on that river, bearing the family name going back 9 years, and among them, not buried, not separated out, sitting in the first box under a tab he had written himself, the January directive and every scrap of paper that connected it to a purchase order in Chester. The lawyers had told him not to do it that way. They told him again in her conference room, with her sitting across the table. And Shaw told him too, which surprised everybody, because she said plainly that she did not want a defendant walking into her office to hand her a case against himself without knowing what he was giving up, and she put the terms on the table anyway, because it was her job. Full cooperation, names, structures, the whole architecture of that river, 30 years of it, everything he had grown up inside of, in exchange for a charge she could live with, and a number of months that would have fit inside a year. He said no. She asked him if he understood what he was refusing. He said he did. He said he would sign anything about himself and would not put his hand on paper about anybody else. And when one of the lawyers began to explain the arithmetic of that again, he said, quietly, that he had spent his whole life inside a house where men bought each other, and that he was not going to leave it by selling the last of it, and that she should charge him with what the documents said he had done. She charged him with what the documents said he had done. And on a Tuesday in February, in a federal courtroom on Market Street, with the radiators knocking, a 63-year-old man named Walter Prescott put his hand on the book and sat down in the chair and told them all of it. He told them about the fittings and the pin bore. He told them about February, and the offer and the parking lot behind the bar on Aramingo, and the $8,000, and he said the number out loud, without being asked to, and he told them that 4 of it had gone to bury his brother, and that the rest was still in a coffee can in his kitchen, and that he had brought it with him to the courthouse that morning, and would like somebody to take it. He told them what Owen Callahan had come to him with, and what Owen Callahan had done with the money afterward, and he told them the date of the appointment with the Federal Safety Office, because he had written it on the inside of a matchbook in March, and had kept the matchbook. A defense lawyer took him through his own guilt for 40 minutes, and Walt Prescott agreed with every word of it, and did not once try to make it smaller. Maeve was in the 3rd row. She had brought Rosalie home from the hospital 11 days earlier, and had left her with Gus Kowalski's sister for the morning. And when the old man came down off the stand, he went past that row without looking at her, because he had told her he would not put that on her in a public place. And she stood up anyway, and he stopped, and neither of them said anything at all, and he went out through the doors. The scaffolding case was reopened that spring, on the strength of the ledger and the requisition, and his testimony. In June it was ruled that the collapse at Pier 6 had not been an accident, that the fittings had been substituted knowingly, and that the platform had been interfered with. The finding of carelessness against the deceased was vacated in a single line on a single page, and the state sent Maeve Callahan a copy of it in an envelope with a window in it, and it said her husband's name, and after his name it said nothing. He was sentenced in September to 26 months, at a federal facility about 2 hours west. And she went out to see him for the first time in November, and they sat on either side of a pane of scratched glass in a room with 11 other people in it, and picked up the telephones. He said, "You look well." She said, "I am not." He said, "How is she?" She said, 4 months old and she is enormous. She eats like a dock worker. Gus's sister says she has never seen anything like it. He said, "Good." Then he said, "Do not do this again." She said, "Do not do what?" He said, "Do not come out here." He said, "It is 2 hours each way with a baby, and it will be 2 hours each way for 26 months. And I want to say this while I have the whole telephone, and you cannot walk out on me the way you did on that pier. Do not wait for me." She did not answer. He said, "I am not asking you to, and I am not asking you not to. I am telling you that if I come out of here in 26 months and you have gone on with your life, that is the correct outcome. That is the one that should happen. And I do not want you sitting in a room somewhere putting your life on a shelf because of a man you met because of the worst thing that ever happened to you." She said, "Is that what you think happened?" He said, "I think I signed a piece of paper in January and your husband is dead." He said, "That does not get smaller in here. It gets bigger, because there is nothing else to do all day." She said, "Walt Prescott took $8,000, and then he sat down in that chair and said so in front of a room full of people. And if you had asked me in the fall, I would have told you there was no coming back from what he did." He said, "There is not." She said, "Then why do I feel like there was?" He did not have an answer for that. Then she said, "Your lawyer came to see me." He said, "I know." She said, He brought papers. He said. I know what he brought, she said. The building on Almond Street, a house in Fishtown, a number I am not going to say out loud in this room. All of it into a trust with Rosalie's name on it. He said, she should have it. Maeve said, no. He said, Maeve. She said, listen to me. My husband is dead because he would not keep money that belonged to people like you, and I have thought about that every single day for a year, and I am not going to raise his daughter on it. I will not do it. Not $1. He said, and if I want to do something for her, she said, then come home in 26 months and do something for her. Come home and be a person who works. She said, that is worth something to a child. The other thing is not. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, all right. She said, I opened the place back up. He said, I heard. She said, the insurance did the roof and the wiring, and the rest of it came out of what the state paid on Owen's file. And it is the same counter, and it is the same board with the same prices on it, and Gus is back in the kitchen with a bad arm, and Walt Prescott sits on the 4th stool every night the way he always did, and I let him. He said, do you? She said, I ring him up now. And a woman named Maeve Callahan sat in a room with 11 other families and a scratched pane of glass and told a man in a state-issued shirt about the price of soup. And neither of them said anything else that mattered. And when the guard called time, she put her hand flat on the glass without meaning to and took it away again. Here is what she carried out of that room and into the rest of her life. That a man can take an envelope on a Thursday and carry it back on the next Thursday, and that the second Thursday is the one that tells you who he was. That an old man can sit on a stool for 5 months, not able to say a thing, and then say it in a courtroom with his hands shaking. And that saying it late is not the same as never saying it. That the people who love us are almost never the ones who never fell. They are the ones who got up and walked back toward the thing they were afraid of. Everybody has a night. What decides a life is the morning after it. If this story reached you tonight, please subscribe to our channel, and leave a like, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it, so that more stories like this one can find their way to more people. And tell us in the comments what you felt while you listened, honestly and from the heart, because we read them, and we are grateful for every one of them. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, quiet days, and a heart at peace. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next story.